There's a phrase that can end a media empire, and in the spring of 2026, a judge in Delaware wrote it down in black and white. Reasonably conceivable that a knowingly false statement was aired to the American public, not by a fringe outlet, not by an anonymous blogger, by the single most trusted news brand in Donald Trump's orbit, the network he calls almost every morning, the network his own advisors watch to see what the base is thinking, the network that has stood beside him through 2 impeachments, 4 indictments, and a re-election campaign built on the promise that everyone else was lying to America except them. Now, that network is the one being accused in a court of law of lying. And the man suing them is not a disgraced election vendor or a forgotten conspiracy theorist. He is a sitting governor of the largest state in the country, a man widely presumed to be positioning himself for a run at the presidency in 2028. And he is asking for $787 million, a number he chose on purpose, because it is the exact amount Fox News once paid to make a nearly identical accusation disappear. This is the story of how a single phone call, a single chyron, and a single sentence spoken on live television became one of the most consequential legal battles of Donald Trump's second term, and why the outcome could reshape not just the relationship between a president and his favorite network, but the legal architecture that has protected American journalism for 60 years. Before we go further, hit subscribe, because what happens inside this courtroom over the next several months will ripple through every newsroom, every campaign war room, and quite possibly the Supreme Court itself, and you're going to want to be here when it does. Here is where this begins. Not in a courtroom, but on the streets of Los Angeles, in the first week of June 2025, when federal immigration raids sparked days of protests that spread through downtown, when store windows were smashed and cars were burned, and when Donald Trump made a decision no president had made in decades. He federalized the second largest city, and by extension, who controls the narrative of what is happening on those streets? Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Trump and Newsom spoke on the phone. What was said, and more importantly, when it was said, would become the fuse for everything that followed. To understand why a single phone call could ignite a lawsuit worth nearly $800 million, you have to understand the relationship between these two men, because this was never just a policy disagreement. Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump have spent years performing an escalating public rivalry, each treating the other as a foil, a villain to be defeated in front of a national audience rather than a fellow official to be quietly negotiated with. Newsom has openly discussed running for president, has mimicked Trump's own combative social media style, has filed his own aggressive legal actions against powerful figures, and has positioned himself deliberately as the Democratic governor most willing to fight Trump in public, on camera, without flinching. Trump, for his part, has treated California under Newsom as a kind of political punching bag, a symbol of everything he tells his supporters is wrong with Democratic governance, from homelessness to crime to what he calls out-of-control immigration, enforcement resistance. When federal agents began conducting immigration raids across Los Angeles in the first days of June 2025, and when the ensuing protests turned into confrontations with police, both men understood they were no longer managing a local crisis. They were staging a national argument about who held legitimate authority. Over an American city, and every word either of them said afterward was about to be dissected by a hostile press on the other side. That is the tinderbox Fox News dropped a match into. Newsom posted publicly that Trump had not called him before deploying troops, framing Newsom. The timeline was murky, the phrasing on both sides was imprecise, and into that fog stepped Fox News anchor Jesse Watters. On his primetime show, Watters aired the clip, framed it as proof that Newsom had been caught in a lie, and laid it than 3 weeks later. 4 words. Gavin lied about Trump's call. Watters didn't stop there. Swanky wine tasting party, while, in his words, riots engulfed Los Angeles and mobs socializing, then governing while his city burned. Newsom's team says almost none of it was true. Not the timeline of the call, not the governor. But the substance of that call bore little resemblance to what Watters described. And Newsom's own social media posts, which Fox pointed to as evidence he had denied the call outright, were, according to Newsom's lawyers, ambiguous at worst, referring to the timing and content of the conversation rather than denying it ever took place. That distinction between a governor disputing the details of a call and a governor supposedly denying a call happened at all is precisely the gap Fox's critics say the network exploited, collapsing a nuanced, disputed timeline into a single, simple, damning headline that fit neatly into a 4-word chyron and a 90-second segment, because nuance does not drive ratings and a clean villain does. And 3 weeks after that broadcast aired, Newsom did something no sitting California governor had ever done to a national news network. He sued Fox News for defamation, filing in Delaware Superior Court, the state where Fox is incorporated, and asking for $787 million in damages, a figure lifted deliberately, almost surgically, from Fox's own history, because that is the exact amount the network paid Dominion Voting Systems in 2023 to end a defamation case over the network's coverage of 2020 election fraud claims. The message embedded in that number was impossible to miss. Newsom's lawyers were saying, in effect, we know what it costs to make you tell the truth, and we are asking for the same price. Fox's public response was immediate and dismissive. The network called the lawsuit a transparent publicity stunt, accused Newsom of trying to launch a 2028 presidential campaign on the back of a courtroom drama, and vowed to defend the case vigorously, confident it would be thrown out before it ever reached a jury. For a while, that confidence looked justified. Defamation cases involving public officials are notoriously difficult to win in the United States, protected by a legal standard that has shielded American media from political retaliation since the 1960s, a standard now sitting at the very center of this fight. That standard is called actual malice, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything that happens next in this story. Under American law, when a public official like a sitting governor sues a news organization for defamation, it is not enough to prove that a statement was false. The official must prove something much harder, that the news organization knew the statement was false when it aired it, or that it acted with reckless disregard for whether it was true or not. This standard comes from a landmark 1964 Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan, decided in the heat of the civil rights era to protect newspapers from being sued into bankruptcy every time a local official disagreed with their coverage. For 60 years, it has been one of the most powerful shields protecting American journalism, making it extraordinarily difficult for politicians to weaponize defamation law against the press that covers them. Fox's entire defense rested on that shield. In court filings, the network argued that Waters had rationally interpreted an ambiguous social media post from Newsom, that the underlying facts about the phone call were murky enough to make any characterization defensible, and that commentary about a sitting governor's conduct during a crisis was exactly the kind of political speech the actual malice standard was designed to protect. Fox pointed out that Waters had, weeks later, walked back the claim on air, attributing the discrepancy to confusion rather than deceit. That should have been the end of it, the network argued. A cable news host offering opinion and later clarifying himself is not the same as a newsroom manufacturing a lie. Newsom's lawyers argued something very different, and this is where the case took its first sharp turn. They didn't just argue that Waters got a fact wrong. They argued that Fox knew it was wrong and aired it anyway because the truth was less useful to the network's narrative than the fiction. To support that claim, they pointed to the very same broadcast that included the wine party accusation, arguing that Fox's own internal culture and its pattern of shaping stories to fit a predetermined conclusion rather than the available facts was itself evidence of the network's state of mind. If Fox was willing to fabricate the image of a governor sipping wine while a city burned, Newsom's team argued, that same willingness to bend reality in service of a narrative extended to the phone call story too. For nearly a year, the case sat in a kind of legal limbo, working through preliminary motions, while both sides waited for a ruling that would determine whether it lived or died. In late January 2026, attorneys for both sides stood before Delaware Superior Court Judge Sean Lugg to argue over whether the case could even proceed to discovery, the phase where each side is forced to hand over internal emails, texts, and communications that might reveal what people actually believed behind closed doors. It is discovery, more than any other stage of a defamation case, that news organizations fear the most because it was discovery in the Dominion case that exposed Fox executives and hosts privately mocking election fraud claims they were publicly promoting to their own audience, testimony and internal messages so damaging that Fox chose to settle for the largest publicly known defamation payout in American media history rather than let a jury see any more of it. Newsom's lawyers wanted that same door opened. Fox wanted it sealed shut for good. It is worth pausing here to understand exactly why discovery terrifies a network like Fox more than any jury verdict ever could. When Dominion's lawyers finally got access to Fox's internal communications during that earlier case, what emerged was not a story about honest reporters making an honest mistake. It was a story about hosts, producers, and even the network's own ownership, privately acknowledging, in texts and emails, that the election fraud claims they were airing to millions of viewers each night were not true, and continuing to air them anyway because the audience wanted to hear them, because a competing conservative outlet was gaining ground by telling viewers what they wanted to believe, and because correcting the record risked alienating the very audience the network depended on for survival. Executives worried in writing about losing viewers to more extreme competitors. Hosts mocked the same guests on camera that they were privately dismissing as unreliable behind the scenes. None of that was ever supposed to see daylight, and all of it became public record, specifically because a judge allowed the case to reach the discovery stage. That is the precedent hanging over every filing Fox's attorneys have made in the Newsom case. It is not an abstract legal risk. It is a documented, specific memory of what happened the last time this exact network was forced to open its internal files to a plaintiff's legal team, and it is the reason Fox is fighting so hard, so early, to keep discovery from ever beginning again. In late April 2026, Judge Lugg delivered his answer, and it landed like a thunderclap through conservative media. In a 42-page opinion, Lugg rejected Fox's motion to dismiss, ruling that it was, in his words, reasonably conceivable that Fox News knowingly aired false statements about Newsom or did so with reckless disregard for the truth. That single finding meant the case would survive, that discovery could proceed, and that the same kind of internal reckoning that ended in a 9-figure settlement for Dominion was now, at least theoretically, back on the table for one of the most politically significant news organizations in the country. This is the moment the story stops being about one governor and one anchor and becomes something much larger, because Fox's response to that ruling revealed just how seriously the network was taking the threat. Rather than accept the decision and move toward trial, Fox's attorneys asked Judge Lugg to certify the ruling for an immediate appeal, a legal maneuver called interlocutory review that would let the network go over the trial judge's head to Delaware's appellate court before discovery could even begin. It is not a move networks make when they are confident a lawsuit is destined to collapse on its own. It is a move networks make when they are trying to buy time, delay the moment their internal communications become public, and hope a higher court sees the case differently than the judge who has already read every page of the complaint. And here is where the story widens out from a single lawsuit into something that touches nearly every branch of American power at once, because Fox is not fighting this battle alone, and it is not fighting only this battle. At the very same moment Newsom's case was clearing its first major hurdle, the network remained locked in an entirely separate and even larger legal fight, a $2.7 billion defamation lawsuit brought by Smartmatic, the voting technology company that Fox hosts and guests repeatedly, and falsely, accused of helping rig the 2020 election in multiple swing states when, in reality, Smartmatic's technology was used in only one American jurisdiction that year, Los Angeles County. As of the middle of 2026, that case remains active in New York State Supreme Court, with an appellate panel granting Fox limited additional discovery, but rejecting the network's attempt to pause the case entirely, keeping it on a track toward trial with no new hearing date yet scheduled. Combined, the Newsom case and the Smartmatic case represent more than $3.5 billion in potential exposure for a single news organization, an amount that would dwarf even the historic Dominion settlement and could, in the most extreme outcome, threaten the network's financial foundation. But the deeper significance of the Newsom ruling isn't really about money, it's about precedent, and about a much larger campaign quietly reshaping the legal battlefield between American presidents and the press that covers them, has pursued an unusually aggressive legal strategy against the American media, suing CBS News over editing choices in a 60 Minutes interview with his 2024 opponent, threatening legal action against CNN and the New York Times over their reporting on the results of a strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, and watching his media company's own defamation suit against the Washington Post get thrown out by a federal judge in Florida just weeks before the Newsom ruling, on the grounds that Trump media had failed to meet that same demanding actual malice standard. Trump has banned wire services from press pools over word choices he disagreed with, pushed regulators to scrutinize broadcast licenses held by networks that declined to air his addresses live, threatening, as recently as this past week, to revoke the licenses of major broadcasters that chose not to preempt their regular programming for a presidential address on election integrity, and watched as the merger between Paramount and Skydance, engineered in part by Larry and David Ellison, drew a fresh lawsuit from shareholders accusing the Ellison family of secretly promising to remake CNN's coverage and funnel tens of millions of dollars in advertising and settlement payments toward Trump in exchange for the administration's blessing on the deal. That shareholder suit alleges the Ellisons cleared regulatory hurdles for their acquisition of Warner Brothers Discovery in part by pledging to reshape one of the last major cable news outlets still willing to challenge the president. And it follows a separate coalition of state attorneys general, entertainment unions, and subscribers who have also gone to court trying to block the merger altogether. Layer all of that together, and a pattern comes into focus that goes far beyond any single case. It is a president and his allies testing again and again in courtroom after courtroom, in FCC filings, in press credentialing decisions, whether the 60-year-old wall protecting American journalists from political retaliation still holds, whether a network that has spent a decade as his most reliable amplifier can be forced, under oath and under discovery, to answer for what its own executives actually believed when the cameras were rolling. And now, for the first time, it is not Trump doing the suing. It is his most loyal governor-turned-adversary doing it to his most loyal network, using the same legal tools Trump himself has been sharpening against everyone else. That is the twist very few people saw coming when this story began. The very legal weapon built to punish hostile coverage of Trump's opponents has just been picked up and turned with startling precision against the network Trump depends on the most. And there may be an even bigger fight waiting behind this one. In June 2026, two sitting Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, used their dissent in an unrelated defamation case, one involving attorney Alan Dershowitz's suit, against CNN to publicly urge the court to revisit the New York Times versus Sullivan standard itself, arguing the actual malice threshold has made it nearly impossible for public officials to hold the press accountable for falsehoods. It was a striking moment, two of the most influential conservative jurists in the country signaling, in writing, that they believe one of the bedrock protections of American press freedom deserves to be dismantled or at least significantly narrowed. Trump has spoken openly and approvingly about that same idea, telling interviewers that the landmark ruling protects what he calls fake news from consequences it deserves, and citing his own successful legal actions against news organizations as evidence that the tide is already turning in his favor. If the Supreme Court ever did revisit Sullivan, it would not just affect Fox News or CNN or the Washington Post. It would rewrite the rules governing every reporter, every anchor, and every news organization in the country, permanently lowering the bar for public officials, including presidents, to sue journalists who criticize them and potentially exposing small local newspapers with none of Fox's legal budget or Delaware incorporation strategy, to ruinous litigation over honest reporting mistakes. The irony sitting at the center of all this is almost too sharp to ignore. End-driven largely by conservative plaintiffs and a conservative president, and yet the case currently doing the most damage to that same legal fortress belongs to a Democratic governor using the existing, still intact actual malice standard to drag Trump's favorite network into discovery anyway. Newsom did not need Thomas and Gorsuch to weaken Sullivan for him. He met the standard as it already exists, according to a Delaware judge who read every page of his complaint, and that alone should trouble anyone hoping the current legal framework simply protects friendly outlets and punishes unfriendly ones. The law, at least in this instance, cuts in whatever direction the facts point, regardless of which side of the political aisle is holding the microphone. So what happens next? The interlocutory appeal Fox requested is still winding through Delaware's court system. And if the appellate court declines to intervene, discovery could begin in earnest, opening the door to the exact kind of internal communications that sank Fox in the Dominion case, executive emails, producer text messages, private assessments of what Waters and his team actually believed about that phone call versus what they chose to broadcast. If that discovery process produces anything close to what emerged in the Dominion litigation, the pressure on Fox to settle quickly and quietly will only intensify, and few in the network's own general counsel's office would be surprised if a settlement number, whether it lands near Newsom's requested $787 million or somewhere well below it, arrives long before a jury is ever seated. Meanwhile, the Smartmatic case looms in parallel, a second sword hanging over the same network at the... There's also the question of what a trial itself would look like if it ever gets that far. Unlike the Dominion case, which settled on the eve of opening statements, a Newsom trial would put a sitting California governor on the witness stand against one of the most recognizable anchors in cable news in a Delaware courtroom, with cameras almost certainly present outside, if not inside, transforming a defamation case into a live political spectacle unlike anything American media law has produced before. Legal analysts who have watched the case closely note that Fox's own past settlement in the Dominion matter, reached specifically to avoid public testimony from its top executives and hosts, suggests the network has little appetite for repeating that experience with an even higher profile plaintiff and an even more politically charged backdrop. Every incentive on Fox's side points toward resolution before testimony, not after. For Gavin Newsom, the political calculus is just as consequential as the legal one. A governor widely seen as laying groundwork for a 2028 presidential run is now positioned, win or lose, as the man who took on Trump's most powerful media ally and forced a judge to say, in writing, that it was reasonably conceivable the network had lied. Even a modest settlement, paired with the public relations value of that court finding alone, hands Newsom a campaign talking point money cannot easily buy, a real, documented, judicially recognized instance of a conservative media giant caught in the exact kind of falsehood it built its brand accusing others of spreading. Fox, for its part, cannot simply write this off as a nuisance suit the way it initially framed it, not with the network's own financial exposure from Smartmatic still on the table, not with a federal judiciary and a Supreme Court that may be reconsidering the very legal standard protecting it, and not with a White House watching every headline about press credibility with open, strategic interest, aware that any weakness Fox shows in this case could be cited against it, ironically. And that brings us back to where we started, to that single simple word sitting at the heart of this entire saga. Panic is not a legal term. It does not appear in any court filing, any judicial opinion, or any sworn testimony. What does appear in a 42-page ruling from a Delaware judge is something almost as striking, a formal written acknowledgement that the network Donald Trump has trusted more than any other might have knowingly lied to the American public, and that a jury may soon get the chance to decide exactly that. Whether that finding rattles boardrooms in New York, whether it reaches the Oval Office is anything more than background noise, whether it becomes the case that finally cracks open Fox's internal communications the way Dominion once did, none of that is confirmed yet. It is, in the language of the court itself, reasonably conceivable. And in American politics, in American media, and in the uneasy alliance between a president and the network built in, his image, reasonably conceivable, has a way of becoming reality faster than anyone inside that alliance would like to admit. What is confirmed is this. A sitting governor is suing a sitting president's favorite news network for defamation, and for the first time, a court has said the case is strong enough to survive. Whatever comes next, discovery, appeal, settlement, or a headline-grabbing trial, the outcome will help decide how much protection the American press still has, how far a president's allies can go in shaping the news before the law steps in, and whether the wall built in 1964 to protect journalism from political retaliation can survive a political era unlike any that wall was ever designed to withstand.